The chamber was massive and filled with delegates from 1,000 different worlds. Ambassador Karen Mitchell stood at the human podium and adjusted her tablet one last time. She had rehearsed these words for weeks, but her voice remained calm and steady. The speech was simple and direct because that was how humans preferred to communicate. She told the assembled representatives that humanity was leaving the Galactic Council effective immediately. The withdrawal was legal under Article 47 of the Council Charter, and all proper documentation had been filed 3 months prior, as required by galactic law. Most of the delegates weren't even listening. The Vrin representative was busy negotiating a shipping contract with the Keltharan Commerce Minister. The Zephrani counselor was reviewing economic data on his crystalline display pad. A group of insectoid delegates from the hive worlds chittered amongst themselves about upcoming votes on mining rights. Karen noticed all of this, but her expression never changed. She finished her statement and thanked the council for the opportunity to participate in galactic governance for the past 2 centuries. Then she gathered her papers and walked toward the exit. Behind her, a few delegates glanced up briefly. 1 or 2 made notes on their devices. The Vrin representative waved a dismissive appendage and returned to his negotiations. The session moderator called for the next item on the agenda without acknowledging what had just occurred. Karen walked through the tall doors of the chamber, and they closed behind her with a soft hiss. In the corridor outside, she was met by her staff of 12 diplomats and analysts. They had already packed everything from the human embassy. Personal items had been shipped home weeks ago, and official documents had been digitized and securely stored. The embassy itself would be left clean and empty with the keys transmitted to council administration. Danny Rodriguez commanded the transport vessel waiting in orbit above the council headquarters station. He had been with the diplomatic corps for 15 years and had seen humanity try again and again to make meaningful contributions to galactic society. Every proposal was met with polite disinterest. Every offer of assistance was declined with barely concealed condescension. Every scientific breakthrough shared freely was accepted without gratitude. He watched on his screen as Ambassador Mitchell and her team boarded the shuttle that would bring them up to his ship. Within 2 hours they were aboard, and the transport was moving away from the station. The departure was smooth and professional. Every human embassy across council space closed simultaneously. Over 300 diplomatic stations went dark within a 72-hour window. Human liaisons working in council departments submitted their resignations and departed quietly. Human scientists at collaborative research facilities packed their equipment and left detailed notes for their replacements. Human military advisors serving with council defense forces completed their current assignments and politely declined renewal of their contracts. Human merchants closed their shops in the great trade stations and dissolved their business arrangements. Human doctors finished treating their current patients and transferred medical records to local physicians. Human teachers concluded their courses and said goodbye to students who barely noticed their departure. It was the most organized withdrawal in galactic history. No drama and no angry speeches. No sabotage and no destruction. Humans simply stopped being part of the council and went home. The transition was so smooth that many species didn't notice for several weeks. When they did notice, most assumed it was temporary. Surely the humans would return once they had made whatever political point they were trying to make. The council had existed for 12,000 years, and hundreds of species had threatened to leave at various times. None ever actually did because membership in the council meant access to galactic markets and protection under council law. But humanity wasn't threatening. They were just gone. Every communication channel went silent. Every trade agreement was properly terminated with all obligations fulfilled. Every joint project was concluded or handed over to other partners. Every debt was paid and every contract was honored. There was nothing to complain about legally. The humans had followed every rule and procedure perfectly. They had given the required notice and they had left everything in order. The council couldn't protest because there was no violation of law. The humans had every right to leave and they had exercised that right. On Earth, President Linda Hayes addressed a joint session of the Global Parliament. The chamber was smaller than the council hall, but it was filled with humans who actually listened when she spoke. She explained that humanity had spent 200 years trying to be good galactic citizens. They had shared their technology freely. They had offered medical assistance during plagues. They had mediated disputes between species that refused to speak directly to each other. They had fought in council defense forces during border conflicts. They had contributed scientific research that advanced galactic understanding of physics and medicine and agriculture. And through all of that, they had been treated as junior partners at best and irrelevant annoyances at worst. The vote to withdraw had been unanimous across all human colonies. Earth and Mars, and the settlements on Europa and Titan, and the mining stations in the asteroid belt, and the agricultural worlds in the Tau Ceti system. Every human government had agreed that continued council membership served no purpose. The council didn't value human contributions and didn't listen to human concerns. Humanity's single vote among thousands meant nothing in council decisions. Their 3 colony worlds were considered insignificant compared to empires that controlled hundreds of systems. Their 2 centuries of membership was barely a moment compared to civilizations that had existed for millions of years. So humanity decided to focus on themselves. They would develop their own colonies and advance their own technology and build their own future. They would trade with species who wanted to trade with them and ignore those who didn't. They would help those who asked for help and leave alone those who preferred to be left alone. It was a simple philosophy, and it made sense to every human who heard it. There were no protests in the streets and no angry debates in Parliament. The decision felt right in a way that council membership never had. Captain Danny Rodriguez transmitted the final departure notification as his ship crossed into human territory. The message was logged by an automated council system and filed away. No acknowledgement came back. No one at the council even noticed that the last human vessel had left their space. Danny looked at his crew and saw the same expression on every face. Relief mixed with something else. Freedom maybe, or possibility. They were going home to build something new, and they were leaving behind a galaxy that had never really wanted them there in the first place. 3 months passed, and the Vryn Concordat faced a problem they had never encountered before. Their agricultural worlds were dying, and nobody could explain why. The soil itself seemed to be rejecting the crops, and entire continents of farmland were turning gray and lifeless. Millions of Vryn faced starvation if the problem couldn't be solved quickly. The Concordat's best scientists examined the soil and ran countless tests, but they couldn't find a solution. Finally, someone remembered that humanity had sold them soil regeneration technology 15 years ago. The technology had worked perfectly and required only minor updates every few years. Those updates had stopped coming 3 months ago. The Vryn sent a standard purchase order to the human commercial networks. They offered twice the usual price because the situation was urgent. The response came back within hours, and it was polite but absolutely final. Humanity no longer conducted business outside their own borders. All existing contracts had been properly completed or terminated. No new agreements would be made. The message thanked the Vryn for their past business relationship and wished them success in solving their agricultural challenges. Then the communication channel went dead. Ambassador Kellis brought the matter before the council. He was confident this was just a negotiation tactic. The humans obviously wanted something, and the council simply needed to figure out what that something was. The council sent an official inquiry through diplomatic channels. The message bounced back as undeliverable. They tried again using emergency frequencies. Those were blocked too. Every human communication network had been reconfigured to reject incoming messages from council systems. The humans weren't being hostile, and they weren't making threats. They simply weren't accepting calls. The Zephrani Empire discovered their own crisis around the same time. Their military fleet depended on navigation systems that used human-designed quantum computers. The systems needed regular software updates to maintain accuracy. Without those updates, the navigation began to drift. At first, the errors were small, but they grew worse each day. Ships started arriving at wrong coordinates. Fleet formations couldn't maintain proper spacing. The Zephrani engineers tried to fix the problems themselves, but the mathematics involved were far beyond their current understanding. They had always just purchased the updates from human companies and never bothered to learn how the systems actually worked. The Keltharan faced a medical emergency when a new plague appeared on their industrial worlds. The disease spread quickly, and their doctors didn't know how to treat it. Their entire medical system had been reorganized 20 years ago based on human research and protocols. Human doctors had trained an entire generation of Keltharan physicians. Those human doctors had always been available for consultation during previous outbreaks. Now, when the Keltharan sent urgent messages to their human medical contacts, there was no response. The messages weren't rejected, and they weren't returned. They simply vanished into silence, Council Arbiter. Then called an emergency session. The chamber was more crowded than usual because delegates were starting to realize something was wrong. Then stood at the central podium and declared that humanity was obviously trying to pressure the council into offering them concessions. This was a simple negotiation, and the council just needed to figure out what the humans wanted. Several delegates nodded in agreement. The humans were young and probably inexperienced at galactic politics. They would make their demands soon enough, and then things would return to normal. The council dispatched 3 diplomatic vessels to human space. Each ship carried senior ambassadors and generous offers of trade agreements and political concessions. Each ship was turned away at the border by automated defense platforms. The platforms were polite and professional. They thanked the council for their interest and informed them that humanity was not accepting visitors at this time. The platforms suggested that the council respect humanity's decision to pursue an independent path. Then the platforms stopped, responding to hails, and the diplomatic ships had no choice but to turn back. Junior Counselor Merrick's was young for a council member, and he had always been curious about the species that came and went through galactic politics. He decided to review humanity's record during their 2 centuries of membership. What he found shocked him. The humans had authored or co-authored 73% of all technological innovations adopted by the council in the past 50 years. They had mediated 62% of disputes that never escalated into wars. They had trained specialists from over 400 different species in various scientific and technical fields. They had contributed more research papers than any 3 other species combined. Their economic activity had been modest, but their knowledge sharing had been extraordinary. Merrick's brought his findings to the council leadership. He showed them charts and data that painted a very different picture of humanity than most delegates held. The humans hadn't been minor members at all. They had been essential members who were treated as if they were minor. The difference was important. The council had functioned smoothly because humans were quietly solving problems and filling gaps and making everything work better. Now those humans were gone and the gaps were becoming visible. More problems emerged as the weeks passed. The pan-galactic trade network crashed for the first time in 8 centuries. The system handled routing for 10,000 shipping lanes and trillions of transactions per day. It had been running on algorithms designed by a human programmer named Frank Peterson, who had worked for the Council Commerce Division 30 years ago. Frank had updated and maintained the system ever since. Those updates had stopped. The system began making errors and then more errors, and finally it simply crashed. Trade across the entire galaxy ground to a halt. The Council's defense grid started showing malfunctions. Sensors failed to detect incoming asteroids. Communication between military units became unreliable. Warning systems triggered false alarms or failed to trigger at all. Admiral Vorath pulled maintenance records and discovered that human technicians had been quietly patching and updating the defense grid for decades. Their work had been so seamless that nobody noticed it was happening. Now that work had stopped and the grid was falling apart. Engineer Nicole Hayes had been one of those technicians. She had spent 12 years working on Council defense systems, and she had enjoyed the work. Now she was back in human space designing new sensor networks for human colonies. She heard about the problems with the Council defense grid through unofficial channels. She felt mild sympathy, but nothing more. The Council had paid her salary but had never appreciated her work. Her supervisors had barely known her name. Now she had better things to do than worry about systems that belonged to people who had never valued her contributions. Counselor, Vess reviewed a human research paper on quantum field harmonics that she had downloaded years ago. She read it carefully this time instead of just skimming it. The mathematics was elegant and made complex concepts seem obvious. Her own scientists had been working towards similar conclusions for decades and were still years away from a breakthrough. The human researcher had solved it casually and published it as a minor academic paper. The author's name was Greg Turner, and he had written it while finishing his doctoral dissertation. It was considered basic work by human standards. Vess began pulling more human research papers. She found thousands of them covering every field from medicine to physics to agriculture. Every single paper showed the same pattern. Humans approached problems differently than other species. They made intuitive leaps that seemed obvious only after someone explained them. They saw connections that others missed. They solved problems that other species considered impossible, or at least extremely difficult. And they had been sharing all of this freely with the Council for 200 years. The galaxy was beginning to understand what it had lost. The humans had departed quietly and left behind a civilization that depended on them far more than anyone had realized. 6 months after humanity's departure, the galaxy's infrastructure was collapsing in ways that nobody had predicted. The problems had started small and manageable, but they multiplied faster than anyone could handle. Every system that humans had touched was now failing, and there were far more of those systems than the Council had ever realized. The Vryn agricultural crisis had spread to 7 more worlds, and famine was killing thousands every day. The Zafrani fleet was grounded because their navigation systems were completely unreliable. The Keltheran plague had killed millions and showed no signs of stopping. These were just the visible disasters, and beneath them were hundreds of smaller failures that were adding up to a civilization-wide breakdown. The Pan-Galactic Trade Network was still offline and nobody could fix it. The best programmers from 20 different species had examined the code and declared it impossible to repair. The algorithms were too complex and too interconnected. Changing one part broke 3 other parts, and fixing those broke 7 more. Frank Peterson had built the system with a kind of elegant simplicity that looked easy until someone tried to modify it. Then it became clear that every piece depended on every other piece in ways that weren't obvious. The network would need to be completely rebuilt from scratch, and that would take years. In the meantime, trade was happening through primitive point-to-point connections that could only handle a fraction of normal traffic. The Council's defense grid was in even worse shape. Admiral Vorath had assembled a team of the best military engineers in the galaxy, but they couldn't restore full functionality. They managed to get basic operations working, but the advanced features were beyond them. The grid could detect large objects but missed smaller threats. It could communicate between nearby units, but long-range coordination was impossible. It could track known vessels but couldn't identify new ones. Nicole Hayes had maintained over 3,000 different systems simultaneously, and had done it so smoothly that nobody realized how complicated the work was. Now those systems were degrading, and there was nothing anyone could do about it. Medical facilities across Council space were overwhelmed. The Keltheran plague was just one of many health crises that would have been manageable with human medical knowledge. Dr. Helen Foster had published hundreds of research papers on cross-species disease treatment, and she had trained thousands of physicians from dozens of different species. Her protocols had been so effective that most species had adopted them as standard practice. But the protocols only worked if people understood the reasoning behind them. The Keltheran doctors had followed the steps without learning the underlying principles. Now when they faced a new disease, they didn't know how to adapt the protocols. Helen was back on Earth developing new treatments for human populations, and she had no interest in helping people who had never appreciated her work. The Council tried desperately to reverse engineer human technology. They assembled teams of scientists and gave them unlimited budgets and told them to figure out how the humans had done what they did. The teams failed again and again. Human innovation wasn't just about the end result, but about the entire approach to problem solving. Humans saw patterns that other species missed. They made connections that seemed random until someone explained them. They took risks that older civilizations found uncomfortable. Most importantly, they shared information freely within their own scientific community, which meant that human knowledge built on itself rapidly. Council species hoarded their discoveries and protected their patents and kept secrets from each other. This meant that Council science advanced slowly while human science had accelerated exponentially. Counselor Vess had become obsessed with understanding how humanity thought. She read everything humans had ever published and watched recordings of human scientists explaining their work. She attended old lectures that humans had given at Council universities. What she discovered was both fascinating and disturbing. Humans were not smarter than other species, but they were more creative. They tried things that other species dismissed as impossible. They failed constantly, but they learned from every failure. They built on each other's work instead of competing. They valued questions more than answers because questions led to new discoveries. The Keltheran economy collapsed when their financial networks failed completely. Human mathematicians had designed the fraud detection systems that kept the networks secure. Without those systems, corruption spread like wildfire. Money disappeared from accounts and nobody could track where it went. False transactions were processed as legitimate. The entire banking system ground to a halt within 3 weeks. The Keltharan government tried to restore order, but they didn't understand the mathematics behind the security systems. They implemented simple solutions that criminals defeated within hours. The economy went from digital currency back to physical barter in less than a month. The Zephrani military discovered that their supply chain had completely broken down. They had weapons but no ammunition. They had ships but no fuel. They had soldiers but no food to feed them. Human logistics specialists had optimized the supply system over 40 years and had made it so efficient that the Zephrani military had reduced their supply core to almost nothing. Why maintain expensive warehouses and supply officers when the system delivered everything exactly when and where it was needed? Now the system was failing and there was no supply core to fall back on. The Zephrani were learning a painful lesson about the difference between efficiency and resilience. The Vryn famine was entering its worst phase. 17 agricultural worlds were now affected and the death toll was approaching 10 million. The Vryn had been so dependent on human soil regeneration technology that they had stopped teaching traditional farming methods. An entire generation of farmers had grown up trusting the technology to handle everything. Now the soil was dead and nobody knew how to restore it naturally. Human agricultural scientists had tried to teach sustainable farming practices, but the Vryn had ignored those lessons because the technology made them unnecessary. Now those scientists were gone and their knowledge was gone with them. Through all of this, humanity remained completely silent. Their borders were closed and heavily defended. Their communication networks refused all incoming messages from Council space. They weren't hostile and they weren't threatening. They were simply absent. The automated defense platforms at the border still delivered the same polite message to anyone who approached. Humanity wished the Council well and hoped they would respect the human decision to pursue an independent path, nothing more and nothing less. Junior Counselor Merrickx had compiled a comprehensive report on humanity's contributions to galactic civilization. The report was 3,000 pages long and it still didn't cover everything. He presented it to the full council during an emergency session. The chamber was silent as delegates read through the summary. 73% of recent technological advances, 62% of successful diplomatic mediations, training for specialists from 400 species, medical protocols that had saved billions of lives, agricultural techniques that fed trillions, financial systems that enabled galactic commerce, defense networks that protected everyone, and more and more and more. One delegate finally spoke up. He was from a species that had joined the Council 800 years ago and had always considered humanity to be irrelevant newcomers. He asked the question that everyone was thinking. How had they missed this? How had an entire galaxy failed to notice that one young species was holding everything together? The answer was uncomfortable but obvious. They hadn't wanted to notice. Humanity was young and their empire was small and their history was brief. In a galaxy of ancient civilizations, it had been easy to dismiss them. Nobody had bothered to look closely at what the humans actually did. They had just assumed that young meant insignificant. The Council was learning that assumption had been catastrophically wrong. 1 year after humanity's departure, the Galactic Council faced a threat that would have been manageable under normal circumstances, but now seemed impossible to handle. The Kesson horde came sweeping across the Outer Rim territories like a storm of violence and destruction. The Kesson were a nomadic warrior civilization that raided settled worlds every few decades. The Council had always repelled them before through coordinated military action. Multiple species would combine their fleets and share intelligence and execute unified battle plans. The Kesson were fierce fighters, but they couldn't match the organized power of the Council's combined forces. This time was different. The defense coordination systems were barely functional. Intelligence networks couldn't track Kesson movements across multiple sectors. Supply chains couldn't support prolonged military operations. Communication between different species fleets was unreliable at best. Each species fought bravely, but they fought alone. The Vryn fleet engaged the Kesson in the outer reaches, and was destroyed because reinforcements couldn't find them in time. The Zephrani military set up defensive positions that collapsed when supplies failed to arrive. The Keltherans sent their ships into battle with outdated intelligence that led them into ambushes. Individual courage meant nothing without coordination, and the coordination that humans had quietly maintained for decades was gone. The Kesson advanced steadily and captured system after system. Millions fled ahead of the invasion and became refugees with nowhere to go. The Council emergency response systems couldn't handle the crisis. Human disaster relief specialists had designed those systems and had trained the personnel who ran them. Now the systems were overwhelmed, and the personnel didn't know how to adapt. Refugee camps ran out of food and medicine. Transport ships couldn't find safe routes through war zones. Children died from preventable diseases because medical supplies went to the wrong locations. Council Arbiter. Then watched the disaster unfold from his office overlooking the Great Chamber. He had been arbiter for 70 years and had guided the council through countless crises. He had always been confident in the council's ability to handle any threat. Now that confidence was shattered. The council was failing and Then knew exactly why. They had taken humanity for granted and now they were paying the price. He made a decision that went against everything he believed about council dignity and protocol. He ordered his personal vessel prepared and told his pilot to set course for human space. The journey took 3 days and Then spent that time rehearsing what he would say. He had never apologized to anyone in his long career, and the words felt strange in his mind. But pride was a luxury the council could no longer afford. At the human border, the automated defense platforms delivered their standard message, then recorded a personal plea. He identified himself and explained the situation. He admitted that the council had been wrong to dismiss humanity. He asked for help not as a political favor but as a humanitarian necessity. Species were dying and the council couldn't stop it. The response took 3 days. Then waited in orbit and watched the platforms, but they remained silent. Finally, a message came through, and it was from President Linda Hayes herself. The message was text only and it consisted of one word: no. Then stared at his screen in disbelief. He had humbled himself and admitted fault and asked for help. The humans had simply refused. His aide pulled up a secondary message that had arrived moments later. This one was longer but not more encouraging. The message explained that the Galactic Council had abundant resources and vast knowledge and ancient wisdom. 10,000 member species possessed technologies and capabilities beyond counting. The solution to the Council's crisis existed within their own collective abilities. Humanity respectfully declined to interfere in Council affairs. The message ended by wishing the Council success in overcoming their current challenges. It was polite and formal and absolutely final. Then realized with bitter irony that the message echoed every dismissal humanity had received during their 2 centuries of membership. Lieutenant Commander Chris Bennett was stationed at the border, outpost that had transmitted Then's message. He watched the council vessel depart and felt nothing. No anger and no satisfaction, just a quiet understanding that humanity had moved on. The council's problems were no longer human problems. Chris had spent 8 years serving as a liaison with council military forces. He had offered advice that was ignored and suggestions that were dismissed. He had watched council officers make obvious mistakes and refused to learn from them. Now those officers were facing the consequences and Chris was glad he wasn't there to watch. Back in council space, desperation was forcing innovation. The Vryn had no choice but to develop new agricultural techniques without human help. Their methods were less efficient and more labor-intensive, but they worked. Farmers rediscovered traditional practices that had been abandoned generations ago. They experimented with crop rotation and natural fertilizers and soil management. Progress was slow and painful, and millions died during the learning process. But slowly, the Vryn were feeding themselves again. The Zephrani were rebuilding their navigation systems from first principles. Their mathematicians worked around the clock, developing new algorithms. The work was brutal and many researchers suffered mental breakdowns from the stress. But breakthroughs came. The Zephrani advanced their understanding of quantum mathematics by centuries in just 6 months of crisis-driven research. Their new navigation system was inferior to what the humans had provided, but it was theirs and they understood how it worked. More importantly, they could maintain it and improve it themselves. The Keltharan reorganized their medical system based on fundamental principles rather than memorized protocols. They studied human research papers not to copy them but to understand the reasoning behind them. They trained a new generation of doctors who could think independently and adapt to new situations. The plague still killed millions, but eventually the Keltharan doctors found treatments that worked. The solutions were different from what humans would have developed, but they were effective. Counselor Vest took charge of rebuilding the Defense Coordination Network. She assembled teams from 20 different species and forced them to work together. The collaboration was difficult, because species that had competed for millennia now had to share information freely. But the Kessin threat left no room for pride or secrets. Engineers shared techniques and scientists compared data and military strategists developed joint tactics. The new coordination system took 6 months to build, and it was inferior to what humans had maintained. But it was functional and it was improving. The Kessin advance finally stalled at the Battle of Terminus Station. The Council fleet that met them there was smaller than it should have been, and less well coordinated than it could have been. But it was united in a way that Council forces hadn't been in centuries. The Vryn and Zafrani and Keltherin fought side by side. They covered each other's weaknesses and supported each other's strengths. They communicated clearly and followed joint battle plans. They won not through superior technology, but through genuine cooperation. The Kessin withdrew and the Council had breathing room to continue their rebuilding, then addressed the full Council 1 year after his failed mission to human space. He stood at the central podium and looked out at representatives from 10,000 worlds. He told them the truth without softening it. The Council had survived, but barely. They had lost millions of lives and trillions in resources. They had been forced to rebuild systems that had worked perfectly before. All of this had happened because they had dismissed a species that held their civilization together. The humans had departed quietly and left the Council to face the consequences of their own arrogance. The chamber was silent. Every delegate was listening because they had all learned the same painful lesson. Competence was more important than age. Contribution mattered more than history. And taking anyone for granted was a mistake that could destroy civilizations. 3 years after humanity's departure, the galaxy had settled into a new normal that nobody would have recognized before. The Council still existed and still governed thousands of worlds, but it functioned differently now. Species that had barely spoken to each other for millennia were working together because they had no choice. The old attitude of hoarding knowledge and competing for advantage had given way to genuine cooperation. It wasn't because anyone had suddenly become more enlightened, but because survival demanded it. The crisis had taught the galaxy a lesson that no amount of peaceful discussion could have accomplished. Beyond the Council's borders, humanity was thriving in ways that surprised even themselves. Their 12 colony worlds had grown to 50 in just 3 years. Without Council regulations limiting where they could settle and what technologies they could use, the humans had expanded rapidly. They found rich worlds that the Council had marked as too difficult or too dangerous to colonize. The humans took the risks that ancient civilizations avoided, and they succeeded more often than they failed. Their population was growing and their economy was booming, and their technology was advancing in directions the Council had never imagined. Captain Sophie Grant commanded the A exploration vessel Horizon as it charted new regions far beyond Council space. Her crew of 80 specialists had been traveling for 18 months and had discovered 17 new habitable worlds. They had made first contact with 6 species that the Council had never encountered. Some of those species were primitive and some were advanced, but all of them were treated with respect. The humans didn't arrive with demands or threats. They offered trade and friendship and accepted refusal gracefully. 3 of the new species had signed cooperation agreements with humanity. 2 had chosen to remain isolated, and the humans respected that choice. 1 was still considering their options. Sophie's mission was simple: explore and learn and establish peaceful relations wherever possible. She had complete authority to make decisions without waiting for approval from Earth. This was different from how the Council operated. Council exploration missions required committee approval for every significant action. Human explorers were trusted to use their judgment and accept the consequences of their choices. Sophie had made mistakes during her mission and had learned from them. Her crew had faced dangers and overcome them. They had solved problems that nobody had anticipated. They were building relationships and gathering knowledge that would benefit humanity for generations. On Earth, scientists worked in laboratories that would have violated a dozen Council regulations. They experimented with technologies that the Council considered too dangerous or too unpredictable. Some experiments failed spectacularly and taught valuable lessons. Some succeeded beyond expectations and opened new possibilities. Dr. Helen Foster had developed treatments for 3 diseases that the Council had declared incurable. She had done it by ignoring conventional wisdom and trying approaches that seemed crazy until they worked. Her methods would have been banned under Council oversight, but in human space she was free to follow her insights wherever they led. Engineer Paul Martinez supervised construction of humanity's first Dyson ring around a distant star. The project was massive and ambitious and would have required decades of Council committee meetings before receiving approval. The humans had debated the idea for 6 months and then started building. The ring was designed to capture solar energy on a scale that would power entire sectors of human space. It was also a statement that humanity could accomplish great things without asking permission. Paul's team included engineers from 2 of the new species that Sophie's mission had contacted. They were learning human construction techniques and sharing their own knowledge in return. Admiral Jack Morrison commanded humanity's defense fleet. From his flagship orbiting Mars, the fleet consisted of 200 vessels designed according to human strategic thinking rather than Council doctrine. The ships were smaller and faster than Council warships. They used unconventional tactics that emphasized speed and unpredictability over raw firepower. Jack had spent 20 years studying Council military doctrine and had concluded that it was outdated and inefficient. The Council fought wars the way they had always fought them, because tradition mattered more than innovation. Human ships were designed to fight wars in new ways that enemies wouldn't expect. The fleet had been tested twice in the past year. Pirates had attacked a human mining operation in the outer reaches and had been driven off with minimal losses. A species called the Droth had challenged human territorial claims and had retreated after one brief engagement. Jack's ships had performed exactly as designed. They had been outnumbered in both encounters but had won through superior tactics and crew training. Word was spreading through the galaxy that humans were not easy targets despite their small empire. Back in Council space, the younger species were watching humanity's development with great interest. The Lentari had joined the Council 50 years before humanity, and had always felt marginalized by older civilizations. They saw what humanity had accomplished in 3 years of independence, and wondered if they could do the same. The Lentari submitted a formal petition to withdraw from the Council under Article 47. They cited humanity's example as proof that peaceful withdrawal was possible and beneficial. The Council approved the petition without the usual bureaucratic delays. The lesson had been learned and nobody wanted to repeat the mistakes made with humanity. Ambassador Kellis led a Council delegation to the human border 3 years after the departure. He was the same delegate who had dismissed humanity's withdrawal as insignificant. Now he carried a formal proposal for establishing diplomatic relations. The proposal was very different from anything the Council had offered before. It recognized humanity as an equal civilization, rather than a junior member. It offered mutual cooperation without demanding subordination. It acknowledged past mistakes without excessive apology. The document had taken 6 months to write because the Council had debated every word. The automated platforms at the border accepted the proposal and transmitted it into human space. The response came after 2 weeks. It was brief and non-committal. Humanity acknowledged the proposal and would consider it. No timeline was given and no promises were made. Kellis reported back to the Council that the humans were not rushing to restore relations. They were genuinely prioritizing their own interests and the Council would have to wait. Councillor Vess had become humanity's strongest advocate in the Council. She understood what others were still learning. The humans were not punishing the Council and they were not playing political games. They had simply moved on. Whether they ever returned to galactic politics was genuinely uncertain. Vess told the Council that they needed to accept this uncertainty. Humanity owed them nothing and the Council would have to earn human respect rather than expecting it automatically. Meanwhile, human civilization continued its quiet expansion into regions the Council had never explored. Human traders established routes to distant markets. Human scientists made discoveries in fields the Council had abandoned as unproductive. Human artists created works that expressed ideas unique to their species. Human philosophers developed ethical frameworks based on their own history rather than galactic traditions. Humanity was building something entirely their own, and they were doing it without guidance or approval from anyone. Engineer Nicole Hayes was designing sensor networks that could detect threats light years away. Dr. Greg Turner was developing new medical techniques that combined technology and biology in ways that made Council physicians uncomfortable. Lieutenant Commander Chris Bennett was training the next generation of human explorers who would push even further into the unknown. They were all building a future that belonged to humanity alone. The question of whether humans would ever rejoin the galactic community remained unanswered. Some Council delegates believed humanity would return once they had proven their point. Others thought the separation was permanent. Councillor Vess believed the truth was simpler. Humanity would return if and when it served human interest to return, not before and not for any other reason. The Council would have to demonstrate that it had truly changed before humanity would consider renewed relations. For now, the humans were content with their own path. They had departed quietly 3 years ago and left the Council to face the aftermath of its own choices. In doing so, they had taught the galaxy lessons about respect and cooperation that centuries of diplomacy had failed to teach. The Council had survived and learned and changed. Whether that change was enough to earn humanity's trust remained to be seen. The galaxy watched and waited to see what humanity would do next. The humans themselves were not worried about galactic opinion. They were too busy building their future to concern themselves with the past.